Hey everybody, welcome to the Bridgetown Podcast. John Mark Comer here from Bridgetown Church. This is also the Van City Podcast. I'm sitting next to the one and only Josh Porter. If you don't know Josh, he's a church planter that we had the privilege to plant you, a year and some change ago?
A year and some change, yeah.
Yeah, in downtown Vancouver, right over the river from Portland to Oregon. And as you can imagine, you are not hearing a teaching from a Sunday at Van City or Bridgetown. We're actually sitting in the basement of FBC on, what day is today? Tuesday morning, and we are here doing a podcast. If you've been tracking with our podcast, you know that we are teaching through the Sermon on the Mount, and right now we are at the end of chapter 5. So in chapter 5, Jesus lays out 6 examples of his way of life, his kind of way to read the Torah, and 3 of the 6 have to do with nonviolence, in particular the last 2. And so we're done now teaching through the end of Matthew 5 and what Jesus has to say about nonviolence and enemy love, but it just raises so many questions. So rather than do, 2 months of Sunday teachings on this subject, we thought, hey, let's sit down with a few experts on this idea and do a Q&A, or as our good friends at the Bible Project, Tim and John, call it a Q&R, kind of clever, question and response, because we don't have all the answers, and neither do our guests, as brilliant and well thought out as they are. So we, at the top of the list, Preston, you're there at the top of the list of theologians and teachers and writers.
Congratulations.
This subject, maybe we just don't read a lot, but is Dr. Preston Sprinkle, who's here. Hello, Preston. Good morning.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me on.
You're here from Boise, Idaho. And
that's right.
I'm just shocked they even have cell service there.
I know. Yeah, we just got it in last week. So
I imagine you like out on a horse somewhere with a mountain behind you. Something like that. So if you don't know Preston and his work, he is a professor, PhD from Aberdeen in Scotland, and currently you are the president for the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, which is a new development, right, in your story?
Yeah.
Based off of your most recent book, People to be Loved, which is a biblical theology of sexuality, in particular dealing with the LGBTQ question. A lot of people think I know you best for the book that you co-authored with Francis Chan by the name of Erasing Hell, which is a great read. But by far, we love all that you do. But our favorite thing by far is your book, Fight, A Christian Case for Nonviolence, which in my opinion is the best resource that we know of on a biblical theology of nonviolence. It's like our go-to read. So Preston, I don't know if I said this to you, but we do reading clubs in the summer, and right now we have about 40-something people reading through Fight. They are jokingly calling it Fight Club, which I think is missing the point a little bit. But Chuck Palahniuk, he's a Portland author, so that's like one of our Portland exports.
That's how we get him in there.
That's how we get him in there. So we have a number of people reading through your book right now, and that is like our go-to all-in-one place. Like if you want to really take seriously what Jesus and the writers of the Bible have to say about violence and enemy love, here's a great starting place. And there's a couple of things we love about it, love about you. One thing I love about Fight, Preston, is I reread it last week for, 3rd or 4th time. And it, I think, has more Bible in it than any other book I've ever read. Like every page is like, you really only wrote about half the book, and God and his helpers wrote the rest. Secondly, I love that it's really a biblical theology. I love that method, but from Genesis to the end. So usually when you hear a case for nonviolence, it starts in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 with Jesus, or maybe with some like emotionally loaded story from a war or whatever. But you actually start in Genesis, which is a bizarre place at first, but it makes sense once you get into it. And actually my favorite, the most fascinating part of the book for me was all your work on violence in the Old Testament and your reading of the Old Testament as more, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're reading it as more of a critique of what you call nationalistic militarism than an endorsement of it. And I thought that was so fun. It's obviously tons of questions about the Old Testament, but so fun. And the other thing I love about you, before we unleash you, is, and don't take this in the wrong way, but you don't exactly fit the stereotype of a pacifist. And I know you hate that label, and we shy away from it as well for all sorts of reasons. But so if you don't know Preston, like you don't see him right now, he's like this kind of don't know how to describe Preston. He's like a good-looking,
Be careful.
smart bro. Is that mean? Is that like a compliment? I don't know, but like you live in Idaho. You enough said, right? You own guns by your own admission. You just don't kill people with them. You look like you work out a lot. Maybe you're just blessed with genetics. I'm not sure, but you don't fit the stereotype of, like Josh over here. He's a pacifist and he's like a lead singer in a punk rock band. And
I'm a stereotype. You break the mold, Preston.
I ride my bicycle to work, and we both eat a plant-based diet, and we're from Portland. It's a little bit more okay, whatever. But and I think that gives you a lot of credibility. And you just follow Jesus, and you take the Bible really seriously. So, all that to say, welcome to the show.
Wow.
Podcast. We're happy you're here.
That's like the best, most interesting introduction I think I've ever heard.
This is not how people introduce you at parties?
Yeah,
here's a smart bro.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I think I said in the book, most pacifists are pacifists because they couldn't win a fight anyway. Which is kind of a bad starting point.
I can't say that, but you can.
Well, I appreciate that, and I guess I could just start off, where you left off there, and in many ways, I'm not at all a candidate for this, the position that I hold regarding nonviolence. And also, by the way, I do prefer the term Christocentric nonviolence rather than pacifist. And we can get into that a little later, but I do think there's an important distinction there. But most people, Christians included, arrive at a nonviolent position because they were raised in a tradition where violence was sort of shunned. Maybe they were in a denomination like a Mennonite or a Quaker background or something where nonviolence was kind of in the air, if you will. Or they may have like an allergic revulsion to violence. They watch a violent movie and they're like, this is just disgusting, and they hate it. And none of that is true for me. I was raised in the opposite environment where, somebody claimed to be a Christian and a pacifist. I saw that as a contradiction in terms.
Wow.
Like pacifism was on par with being pro-abortion, being a communist, being a pansy, being an atheist. Like they all kind of come together like that just rolled into one. So it took years for me to even cultivate a category where somebody could be a Christ follower and renounce violence. Like that to me was categorically impossible for many years. So, I think I may have even said in the book that I was almost surprised at my conclusion. I was one of the most surprised people at my very conclusion. Like I was not expecting to kind of land where I did.
And how did that happen? I mean, how did you move from kind of position of origin to where you're at now?
So I don't mean this in a condescending or snarky way. I really don't. But the only reason that I would emphatically embrace a position of Christocentric nonviolence is because I believe the Bible teaches it. And it really was my conservative environment that drummed into me a passion for the Bible. If God breathed stars into existence and he also breathed out his word, then we have to go where the text leads, even if it leads us away from traditionally held views. I love, listening to this, or not listening to, but reading the speech of Martin Luther, when he was being condemned, and here is where I stand. I could do no other. I must go where the word of God leads me to go. I can do no other. And that spirit was driven into my bones from an early age, or at least early age of my Christian walk. And it really is that spirit that drove me to embrace the position I do. And I'm not going to say, it would be arrogant for me to say that only nonviolent advocates are true biblical Christians. I know, in fact, most evangelicals who also love the scriptures would not land on the position I do. However, I can say for myself that it was through rigorous ongoing study of not just verses, but as you said earlier, how the whole story of God hangs together. It was through a rigorous and submissive study of that story and of individual texts that led me to the position I hold.
To rethink. Yeah, I mean, you make the point in the book that when I read it, because I grew up in, I think, a somewhat similar tradition than you, not Reform, but that same kind of evangelical conservative world.
Yeah.
You make the point that you just never really thought about it. You just kind of always assumed that violence was an option for followers of Jesus. And I think that rang true with me. It was honestly, it was not something I thought about. There was never really an open question to it. It was just kind of, well, there's violence in the Old Testament. King David was a warrior and a man after God's own heart, and killing is not the same thing as murder. And maybe if somebody's like extra credit, there's something about Romans 13, but it wasn't really thought about, at least in my experience.
It's fascinating. People ask me, what's the best sort of counter perspective that follows your same study, that does a biblical theology? I said, honestly, I've never seen one.
Yes, I asked you that question. I have been looking for years for like a great book that is a biblical theology of even just war theory, much less, the support of nationalism or military. I can't find one.
It doesn't, honestly, it doesn't exist. Like, people simply come to the text assuming that you can kill people if they're trying to harm your family, or if you're serving in the military, that must be okay. I mean, we go to the text with these narratives firmly in place, and then all we need to do is, quote some verses from the Old Testament, dismiss a few from the New, and bada bing, bada boom, and you kind of, reaffirm your position. But I think people don't even realize that they actually have to do a biblical theology to defend the position that violence is the Christian way in some cases,
which may exist. You and I have yet to find a book on it or whatever. That doesn't mean it's not out there. But if you're listening and you know of one, please send it our way.
Yes, I would love to see it.
So I just, on that note, I love your humility that this is a conviction. Like you, if I read you right, you believe that the teachings of Jesus lead you as a follower of Jesus to not participate in violence, but rather to look for creative, nonviolent solutions to fight evil and to love your enemy. But this is in the Western, and in particular in the Protestant and Catholic, and especially in the evangelical tradition, this is a minority position.
Sure.
So most Christians, most evangelicals, most Protestants, most Catholics, most followers of Jesus in the West don't, either because they've not thought about it or because they have and they don't line up with it. It's a minority position. So has it always, give us a little church history.
Sure.
Has it always been this way? Has it always been a minority position? What did the early church have to say on this subject?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly from Augustine, 4th, 5th century onward, it's been the dominant position of the church, although not by any means, exclusive. But what's fascinating is prior to Augustine, you take the first 300 years of Christianity, and these questions revolving around violence and killing, this was a hot issue. This was something Christians actually thought through, and there's a lot of material on it.
Because people weren't living like in the suburb of, Atlanta,
the cornfields of Indiana.
Or whatever. Yeah, like it was a dangerous, violent world. Yeah.
And so you had people getting converted out of the Roman military. You had people faced with the option to confront evil with violence. And so it was a really live question. What is fascinating, one of the most fascinating points that I discovered in my research is that early church leaders prior to Augustine were, as far as we can tell, unanimous in their view that Christians should never, ever take the life of another human being. And they even talked about good killing versus bad killing, or legal killing versus non-legal killing, killing in self-defense or whatever it is. They even made those distinctions, but still concluded that categorically Christians who claim to follow Jesus should never take the life of another human. Now, what is so fascinating about that, what I would, as far as we can tell, this unanimous position, is that the early church wasn't unanimous on anything. Like they couldn't even agree on whether Christ was God or man or how that worked out. They were still hammering out the Trinity. They couldn't even agree on what books belong in the Bible. But when it came to whether or not a Christian should take the life of somebody else, it was like one of the few things that they were unanimous on.
Wow.
Yeah. Again, just several names that people may recognize: Origen, Tertullian, Cyprian, Athenagoras, Lactantius, and Arnobius, and many others that addressed the question. There was no real option B here. Like, they were all committed to a nonviolent perspective until you see the quote unquote conversion of Constantine, which I think is a very important.
Yeah, talk to us about that, because that's a turning point.
Yeah, it is. so you have, prior to the conversion of Constantine, which what was it, about 312 AD, prior to that, Christianity was the persecuted minority. But throughout the, just prior to Constantine, Christianity began to grow. What's fascinating is that the more that the church was persecuted and killed and attacked, the more it grew.
And did not attack in kind.
Exactly. It was committed to a nonviolent perspective that caused the kingdom to grow. But then Constantine sees that.
Yeah, what's the story there for somebody who's never read that? Give us the quick myopic.
So Constantine is he's the Roman Empire is still in charge of the known world at that point. Constantine is the emperor, but he sees that there's all these Christians running around now, so it may be politically expedient for him to be a Christian. So he has this
because he has a problem. I've read a number of people say that that was right about when about half of the empire was in some way, shape, or form Christian or Christianized, and now you have a problem because the persecuted minority is potentially a majority, and you're a politician. You have an issue on your hands.
And I mean, think about that. To go from a position of powerlessness to a position of power almost overnight, that, for some people, they're like, yes, we're not persecuted anymore. We're, now we're in position of power.
Yes, but if you think you would imagine.
You would think that, but man, that is not, it's not a good place when the church is, intertwined with government power. Like that just never goes well. And that's exactly what happened in the wake of Constantine. You have pagan priests being made pagan, pastors overnight, and there's no real conversion there, and leaders are now, Christian in name.
And Constantine, for obvious reasons, was pro-war. Like even his, quote, conversion, which I'd love to hear where you stand. I mean, I know there's a lot of skepticism about whether or not he even was a Christian or whether or not it was a political power play, because so many people in his empire were now following Jesus. But I mean, the conversion stories, he's in battle, right? And he has a vision of a Roman legion and a banner with, I don't know, the cross on it or Christ on it. And if you fight in the name of Christ, you will win. And he does it, and they win. And he claims, well, that's Christ, right? So even his conversion to following a nonviolent, enemy-loving, dying on the cross Messiah is through a battle.
Exactly. Yeah. He used that conversion to sort of bolster his military strength. Which you don't have to be a pacifist or an advocate of nonviolence to see that might be a little twisted. But but so in the wake of that, you have people like Augustine and others who are now the leading Christian thinkers in a time when the church is completely in bed with the state. They're in a position of power. Church and state are blended together as one. So now to protect the state, nonviolence doesn't really work very well when you're trying to rule the world against authority. Exactly.
Which is a great question. I had somebody come up to me and say, on Sunday, in a hypothetical scenario, what if every single person in America became a Christian? And I was like, well, I don't. Call me skeptical, but I don't think we're on track for that.
A pessimist.
But I mean, her point was, and she's a smart thinking woman. This would not work for America at that point? And I think she's right. And I think that was the issue that Augustine and other theologians were wrestling with, right? How do you, when now the empire is Christian and the emperor is quote unquote Christian, it's an empire. Right. It has to make war just to survive. So
totally,
how do we reconcile that with the way of Jesus?
Yeah, Augustine, he really wrestled with that, and he just kind of said, well, times have changed. Jesus' nonviolent teaching just can't. He even would affirm Jesus' nonviolent teaching. In fact, Augustine, who kind of was one of the main architects for just war theory, we can talk about that in a second. He did it out of not because he thought that was what the Bible's teaching, but because the biblical teaching simply cannot be applied in our situation in terms of government authority, so we got to figure something else out. But even Augustine said, when it comes to killing in terms of self-defense, Christians should never kill in self-defense.
Wow. So his argument wasn't, we're misreading Jesus. He's not actually teaching nonviolence and enemy love. His argument was, no, that's what he is teaching, but it doesn't work now for the empire. Is that your interpretation?
Pretty much, Pretty much, yeah. At least that's what kind of launched him into exploring just war theory and seeing if it can kind of fit. But yeah, I think even he had a much deeper appreciation for the nonviolent teaching of Jesus than many people do today.
Okay, so talk to us about just war theory, because I think people hear that and even often cite it, but don't actually know what it is. So what is it? Where did it come from? What was Augustine's relationship to it?
Yeah, so just war theory, well, first of all, just war theory does not come from the Bible. Okay, you can't find just war theory even in the Old Testament. You definitely don't find it in the New Testament. You don't even find it in early Christian teaching. It comes from, the roots of it go back to like Aristotle and Cicero and
right.
other
Greek
secular
philosophy.
thinkers.
Yeah,
totally. To kind of figure out what are some criteria that we can apply to wage war that is a just war, not an evil war. Because even back then you had moral philosophers and thinkers that
right.
They were
promoting. Yeah, Greek philosophers had a high value for morality.
Oh, absolutely. So they would recognize that war is inevitable. So how can we, the main heart behind just war theory is not to wage war; it's to reduce the evil effects,
right,
in war. And in fact, here's what I love about just war theory, and at the end of the day, just war theory is like one sneeze away from nonviolence.
Right. Yeah, and that's good to hear. I don't think most people realize that. They're actually really close.
Yeah, I mean, just war theory says that war is so evil, so bad, so destructive, so horrific that it should only be pursued as an absolute last option. Well, that sounds really beautiful to me, and I just wish people would apply that. I mean, in our day and age, especially in America, that's usually not the spirit. Usually the spirit is, if there's a terrorist attack, we race to, blow up the terrorist or whatever, and we just think that violence is not a last option, but it's really a first option to confront evil. So I think we've actually, in practice, have come a long way away from trying to figure out how can we avoid war at all costs.
So just war theory isn't just a generic idea. There actually are 7 criteria. Am I right? Do you want to lay those out really fast?
Sure. Yeah. There's 7 or 8 depending on how you measure it. So yeah, just briefly, the 7 criteria are just cause. You can't just want to expand your empire and wage war and take over another country. That's not a just cause. You need to have a righteous cause to go to war. Number 2, there needs to be the right authority. You need to have, you need to be like a governing authority to be able to make decisions to go to war. Number 3, right intention, which is kind of like just cause. You have to have the right sort of motivation. Again, not just to expand your oil fields or something like that.
Right. So it has to be self-defense, or an ally nation is invaded by whatever.
Confronting evil, or self-defense, something like that. Number 4 is a kind of a weird one to me, but reasonable chance of success, which kind of raises the question: how do you define success? But in any case, you have to have a good likelihood that you're actually going to win the war, according to the theory. Number 5, which I love, is last resort. All nonviolent avenues of achieving peace must be exhausted before a nation resorts to war. Number 6, proportionate means, meaning that you can't, to give a kind of stupid, crass illustration, if one bomb would do the trick, don't drop 10,
Right. Or nuclear warfare is a great example.
Nuclear warfare, by definition, violates just war theory, probably in almost every one of these 7 criteria.
Yeah. A number of ethicists even argue that any war in the modern world does, because of the way that technology has so reshaped warfare. Yeah. Right?
Well, and that's a great point, too, because just war theory was developed far before...
Yeah, when you had a sword, basically.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And then the last one, the 7th one, I think is, again, one of the most important, is non-combatant immunity. In other words, you can't target civilian populations.
Yeah. Nagasaki or Dresden or whatever.
Yeah, those are some good examples there. Yeah, so you can't drop an atomic bomb on a city filled with civilians, even if you think that might help end the war, which, what's interesting, I mean, World War II is hailed as the good war. People call it the good war. It was, we're taking out the bad guys. But
the line of demarcation between good and evil was probably, I read one historian say, most likely clearer in that war than any other war in human history.
Which, if that's the case, then that is absolutely insane. We killed, we killed millions, targeted millions of civilians. In fact, you mentioned Dresden. A lot of people don't know about Dresden.
It's full-on genocide.
In that 2 to 3 day bombing campaign of an innocent city, it was the greatest massacre in human history since Genghis Khan.
Right, 25,000 people, right? Civilians
in a 2 or 3 day span. Like that's like unparalleled. So if that's the best we can do, then in the words of a just war theorist, Oliver O'Donovan, history knows of no just wars.
Just wars.
Like, we this isn't something we can kind of slap on a war and say that was a good war and this was a bad war. That's not at all possible.
But your point is World War II is essentially the closest we ever... I think World War II is fascinating because of how it's shaped our life, and it's still in somewhat recent memory. And I think it shaped a whole generation's view of war around the kind of good, evil, good guys, bad guys, binary thing.
Yeah.
But it was the closest we ever came to a just war, in that most of our reasons for going to war did meet the criteria, right?
Right.
But the way we went about the war, whether it is carpet bombing of civilians or Dresden in Germany or Nagasaki, Hiroshima, these, like, we're disqualified. We did not make the criteria for the rest of it. Am I right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So is there any American war in our history that does meet all of the criteria for just war theory?
No, absolutely not. And to be fair, though, an honest just war theorist would say, well, that's not
that's
the
not
criteria.
How it works.
Yeah, the criteria is not to sort of be to determine what war is just, what's not. It's trying to reduce. It's trying to give us guidelines to try to reduce the evil of war.
Avoid it if at all possible. Make it more moral, so on.
But Preston, it's interesting to me. You described Augustine's development of just war theory as something that was based more on a sort of pragmatic approach to the times, and it's not necessarily, or in this case, not at all, an adaptation of the scriptures or the teachings of Jesus. In contemporary conversations, folks who are a bit reticent about nonviolence tend to immediately assume that they must be just war theorists if they're put off by the idea of nonviolence. And then their arguments, at least in my narrow experience, tend to be logical arguments. They're not scriptural arguments. They're common sense logic.
Yeah, pragmatic, kind of.
Right. And if what you're saying is accurate, it actually sounds like there's a bit of solidarity they have with Augustine in that Augustine was doing some comments. It was a very philosophical line of reasoning rather than one taken from the scriptures, which is often the case with folks now who are a bit apprehensive about nonviolence.
Well, that's a great point, and that's usually what I'm faced with when I get into conversations on this topic. People begin with, well, I'm not going to let somebody, come in and kill all my kids, gun them down. I'm going to use violence to defend my family. And what about Romans 13? Or, what about person serving in the military? My Uncle Fred is a good man, and he sacrificed his life for your right to be a nonviolent advocate, all these arguments.
Yeah, right.
But none of these are really beginning with Scripture. Now, call me a fundamentalist, but I still have a great love for the Bible, and I'm like, we have to begin with the Bible to develop a biblical theology or an ethic of violence versus nonviolence, and then go to those situations. But in my experience, and it sounds like in yours as well, people usually begin with the pragmatic situation and then go back and find a few verses to make sure they can kind of justify it, which I just think that's completely backwards.
And naturally, we make a lot of assumptions that I'm not sure are right, such as, the assumption that Jesus wants me to live a safe and secure middle class American life, which I want that, and I live that, and I'm grateful for it. But I'm not sure that is an assumption for an apprentice of Jesus.
Right, absolutely.
So your point is, even if just war theory or full-on militarism is right, you have to, as a disciple of Jesus, you have to get there first by some kind of another reading of Matthew 5, Romans 12, 13, 1 Peter 3, Hebrews, the narrative arc of the New Testament, the life example of Jesus, the cross, early church history. If we're reading that wrong, the first place, you have to have another reading or another interpretation. Am I right?
Absolutely. And again, I in my experience, I have not seen people who kind of push back on a nonviolent perspective that they've actually developed that kind of, I love the phrase, the narrative arc of the Bible, in particular the New Testament. But as Bible believing Christians, we have to let the Bible dictate our views, not vice versa.
So what you're saying is that just war theory is actually a close, cousin, if that's the right word, to nonviolence. It has a similar heart posture.
I would say that, yes, the spirit driving just war theory is the same spirit driving driving nonviolence. They're driving at the same thing. They both believe that war and violence is evil. The only question is it sometimes necessary as an absolute last resort after nonviolent means have been pursued? And I'm going to say that spirit that should be driving just war theory and is not the spirit that is that we see all across the American evangelical church. I remember doing some study a while back on just militarism in America. Like we are, and not I'm not saying having a military. I'm saying
militarism,
going above and be militarism, and that's a really important distinction. We are one of, if not the most militaristic countries that the world has ever seen, and people, and so one historian, Andrew Bosovich, he's done a lot of research on militarism in America. He says, were it not for the support offered by several tens of millions of evangelicals, militarism in this country becomes inconceivable. So here's the thing. If you want to advocate for a true just war theory, you want to say violence can be used as a last resort, or if someone's breaking into my home, going to kill my kids, I'm going to use violence, not because I want to, but it's the last resort. Right. If that's really the extent of violence in the evangelical church, then I'm fine with that. I would disagree on even some of that. But the primary problem is not that we will use violence as an absolute last resort on an individual level. Our primary problem in the evangelical church is that we are so profoundly militaristic, and one of the primary reasons why this nation is incredibly militaristic.
Preston, can you unpack that term militarism a little bit, especially in how it contrasts with a true just war ethic?
Yeah, and you use the language of nationalistic militarism, and nationalism means different ththings to different people. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Good question. So militarism has to do with, there's different ways people define it, but putting a lot of stock, energy, money, and faith in military power as the means of preserving your country and confronting evil. Like you're not just having a military. Most countries have a military, but you're actually going to see the military power as the number one thing you need to keep people safe, to advance your cause, or to protect your country. Yeah, you're going to spend an exorbitant amount of money in making it the strongest thing possible. You're going to flex your military muscles to scare off people, and so that's not every country that has a military is militaristic in that sense, but. Again, this is just an observation, not an argument. Nobody would disagree with this, that the America's military is so far off the chart than any other military that the world has ever seen. I mean, again, going back to the Roman Empire or Genghis Khan or whatever, like we put more faith, energy, attention, and money in our military strength than anyone else by far.
And that historian you cited, and a number of others make the point, this would never happen without the support of evangelical Christians.
Yes, absolutely. It goes back to sort of the late 70s, early 80s, when the so-called moral majority and Republican Party and conservative Christianity was all blended together, and they were fighting the evils of communism and pacifists. Was kind of the narrative that I grew up with, and I think you did too.
One of the things, and I've read, and I'd love to have you speak to this, you've read more than me on the history of kind of interpretation of violence, but I've read that there was a shift in the church even after World War II, even prior to the 70s, around the conservative church's view of violence, whereas definitely before World War I, it was much more skeptical of military violence and militarism. Then after World War II, there was a shift. And so one of the things that I chat to people about that is really disorienting to get your head around is this idea that nonviolence comes off as a culturally liberal position, meaning when you think of a pacifist, you think of like a leftist or a communist or a hippie or a make love, not war, whatever. But it is the theologically conservative position, which is why some of like the uber conservative old school denominations, Anabaptists, Mennonite, Amish, Brethren, they're all like uber conservative. Women still wear head coverings. We would say too legalistic, too literal in the reading of the New Testament, but they are pretty much all nonviolent because that's what the Bible essentially says. Whereas what you're calling nationalistic militarism or just militarism is the culturally conservative position. So normally when you hear it, it's from the right on the socio-political spectrum, and it's from more of a kind of Christian, evangelical God and country kind of source. I don't mean that to slam that, where it is actually the theologically liberal position by the true definition of liberalism as you take liberty with the Bible and the teachings of Jesus to make it line up more with your culture. Would you agree with that kind of prognosis? But that's really weird for people to get their head around, in my experience.
No, everything you said, gosh, you said it better than I could. That's spot on. And I think it goes back to framing World War II as the good war. And then in the wake of World War II, you had the glorious era of the 50s, where we're kind of basking in the blessings of having won the war, And then that leads to protests in the 60s and 70s, where now people who are protesting wars are considered liberal and anti-patriotic and interrupting all the flourishing we had in the 1950s. And generally the people protesting wars were also advocating for the sexual revolution and all kinds of things. So it's really easy to
weird things got lumped together.
Absolutely. So there is absolutely a cultural narrative going on there. It's fascinating, and it's really unique to America. I mean, you go around the world and you talk to Christians, and nonviolence is more or less the default position. I remember speaking over in the UK last year, and churches they kept wanting me to talk on controversial topics. And I said, okay, well, I'll talk about hell, I'll talk about LGBT stuff, and I'll talk about nonviolence. And they said, well, no, we want you to talk on controversial issues. You talk about nonviolence, anybody's going to shrug their shoulders and say, well, yeah, of course. Like, do Christians disagree with this? It wasn't even, it'd be kind of weird for somebody to be kind of a Christian and not nonviolent in that culture. And for the most part around the globe, that's kind of the more default position. So it is really unique to the socio-political narrative of the
Western world, of America in particular. Yeah, and even
in the late 20s.
And I hesitate to say this, but even to the kind of Anglo-white culture, I think this is an area where people of color who follow Jesus have been way ahead of us in some really beautiful ways. Of course, Dr. Martin Luther King is the bright, shining example of that. So,
Desmond Tutu in South Africa. And
exactly. And, of course, all the Coptic Christians in India and those living in Syria and through the Middle East, almost all of whom are nonviolent. So, what I hear, I want to move to questions here in a minute, but what I hear all the time is people cite just war theory, and I think they don't normally actually know what the criteria are. It's more of a kind of vague idea. Maybe I'm wrong there. But they cite it as a reason for American militarism, for this or that war, for serving in the U.S. military. So talk me through that. So let's say, hypothetical scenario, I'm an 18-year-old. I go to Bridgetown Church or whatever church in city or wherever in Idaho. I follow Jesus. I love the Bible. I read it every day. I believe it. I have never really thought about this, and now I'm hearing these crazy, liberals. We're not liberals, but crazy, whatever, vegan people in Portland saying, hey, Jesus' teaching has all sorts of implications. One of which you can't kill people. You have to love them, even if that comes at cost to you. So you're hearing that for the first time, but you are thinking about serving in the military. Right or wrong? Like, how does just war theory fit into that? Is that justification? Is it not? How would you process that if you were that 18-year-old, mythic figure?
Yeah, honestly, if an 18-year-old was even raising the question, willing to wrestle with it, I'd be an absolutely happy camper. I think that did I just say happy camper?
Yeah, you showed your cards.
It's okay, man. You're in Idaho. You get a free pass.
I think that in most churches, no one even raises the question of this might be something you should wrestle with. It's just sort of assume that the most heroic thing you can do is go into the military and serve your country and kill the bad guys. So that would be fantastic if the rest of it. I think the number one thing to recognize, again, I said it earlier, but I want to emphasize it again, that the just war theory does not come from the Bible. If people say, well, no, that's the Old Testament. That's what the Old Testament did, right? They sort of endorsed just war theory. I mean, the Old Testament warfare strategy is, number one, reduce your number of combatants to a ridiculous number. Number two, pray and sing worship songs to God. And then number three, go into battle with outdated weapons and an outnumbered army so that when you win, if you're obedient to Yahweh, he gets all the credit and you don't.
Yeah.
I mean, if we actually sought to apply Old Testament war ethics to today,
Yeah.
we would be, I mean, that it just wouldn't. It would
And
be
only
ridiculous.
do it if you hear the audible voice of God saying,
Right.
go and do it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Preston, since you are, kind of lapsing into the different Old Testament and New Testament arguments for and against nonviolence, we actually had a number of questions that people texted in, and some of them deal with, some specific, I think, prevalent and questions that come up all the time as soon as you broach the topic of nonviolence. One of them was that someone asked about two different motifs in the New Testament. One being that Jesus famously has an interaction with the Roman centurion, and it stands to reason his disciples did as well. And Jesus, in that famous interaction, does not say to either the servant, depending on the biography, or to the centurion himself, anything about the Roman military. And then along those lines, later on in Paul's letters, he often favors militaristic sounding metaphors to explain the discipleship to Jesus. So I'm sure that those are things that have come up a lot in your conversations. What do you have to say to those?
Yeah, those are great questions. They do come up a lot, and not to punt, but I do address those more thoroughly in the book. With the interaction with the Roman centurions and Roman soldiers as a whole, those interactions are never intended to give kind of a to Z complete portrait of all the ethical expectations that this potential convert might need to think through. I mean, think about it this way. His interactions with the Roman centurion also never mentions paganism. But it's well known that in the Roman military, people called military commanders like virtual pagan priests. Like, they would have sacrifices every day. They'd be burning incense to all kinds of gods. I mean, the paganism in particular in the military was just, pervasive. And yet Jesus never says anything about, renouncing your belief in other gods or worship of Zeus or whatever. So, those stories are never intended to say, to sanctify staying in the military or not staying in the military, or using violence or not using violence. And in some of these characters that he's interacting with, there was relative peace in the first century, especially, you had some riots that happened later on, but you could, and this is again just what historians say, you could serve in the military and never be called upon to use violence. It's not like they were just chopping people's heads off right and left all the time. So it may not have been that pressing where he had to sort of, jump in and tell them, make sure you don't use violence. May not have been as pressing as we think it should have been. But I think the primary point is we can't read into those stories that he's giving them the totality of the ethical demands that he's, expecting of them in that short conversation.
Yeah, totally. And then Paul, why in the world does Paul, a guy who, if we are to be believed, would have subscribed to a nonviolent worldview, why does he like to throw around terms that seem like he's into military, metaphorically speaking, military imagery?
Yeah, well, he does use those military images, but he guts them of all sort of actual violence. Like, this is a metaphor, a way of conceiving of fighting against the enemy. And this is, I think, important for people to wrestle with and one of the reasons why I don't like the term pacifist is, I believe we absolutely should wage an aggressive war against evil. My question is, what are the means by which we should be fighting evil? Not whether or not we should fight against evil. I want to know, what are the Christian, Christ-centered means by which we fight against evil? So that's why I named my book Fight. Like, I'm not saying don't fight. I'm saying fight vigorously, fight aggressively. But let's figure out how God wants us to fight. So, I'm not at all troubled by those metaphors because, again, those metaphors are gutted from all actual violent application. All he's trying to do is use, familiar terms, familiar images to encourage Christians to fight against evil. And there's an interesting play on words throughout the book of Revelation where you have one of the themes of Revelation is that Jesus has conquered. Now, the word conquer, it's a key word in Revelation, and it's a Greek word nikao, where we get Nike from,
which is based in Portland.
It is that word is infused with violent militaristic connotations. I mean, it was a very popular word in the Roman Empire. Rome conquered this nation, conquered that nation. But what's fascinating is that same word is used throughout Revelation to speak of a slaughtered lamb who conquered evil by dying, not by killing. I mean, that would have caused any Roman soldier to their head to spin, saying, wait a minute, like, he conquered by dying? Like, that doesn't make any sense, but that is the heart of Christian ethics. It doesn't actually make cultural sense.
So a lot of the New Testament use of military symbolism or imagery, in a way, is actually kind of beautifully subversive.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the very term Messiah or kingdom. I mean, all these are militaristic terms that Christ uses, but turns them on their head, for sure.
Okay, here's another question. I know we're running out of time. Quote, it seems that Matthew 5, that's Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, we just went through it, is nearly exclusively dealing with personal things, anger, lust, oaths. Is Jesus breaking this to speak to the corporate, condemning military violence? Did the Jews even have a military at the time?
That's a great question. It comes up quite a bit. I don't, and this deals with deeper, maybe misunderstandings of New Testament ethics. I know it's common to say, personal ethics over here and corporate ethics over there. I don't know if Jesus would have had those distinctions. I think he just painted a vision for how humans are to follow their Creator and to cultivate human flourishing and to follow the crucified Lamb. I don't think he would have said, on an individual level, do this, but if you're working for the government, then you can do this. Like, he didn't have that kind of
separation of church and state was still about 1,500 years out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I think, does it apply to individuals? Yes. Does it apply to individuals working for a certain company? Yes. I mean, I don't think, for instance, I think Christians should love their enemies regardless of their occupation. I think Christians shouldn't commit adultery or lust regardless of their occupation. I can't imagine Jesus saying, well, on an individual level, don't lust after your neighbor. But if you're, working the beaches as a lifeguard at Malibu, it just kind of comes with the
then
job.
It's okay because it's part of, you're getting paid. Yeah.
Yeah. Or, a lawyer, well, certain, jobs in the law field, you just got to do some shady stuff, and that's just demanded by your occupation. So don't really follow, this individual teaching in that occupation. But we do this. A lot of people often use that same logic, saying, well, it's good for Christians not to kill, but if you're serving your country in the military, then that doesn't apply to you. I just think Jesus would be rubbing his eyes at that kind of distinction.
Separate ethical system, yeah. Dale Bruner, which is, as you know, is one of the top scholars on Matthew in the world, and it's not an Anabaptist, comes out of, I think, a Reformed tradition, huge fan of Luther. I have his updated commentary on Matthew, and in the second edition, he actually changed his whole view of Matthew 5 to come around to a nonviolent and enemy love position. And he, which is interesting because similar to you, just spent a lot of years on the other side of the argument. And he labels, of the 6 examples, he labels the first, I think, personal commands, and the last 3, he calls them the political commands. And he doesn't mean political in the sense of Republican or Democrat or democratic, but political in the sense of having to do with, the polis, how we organize as a community. So I think that is a helpful distinction, that Jesus is dealing with stuff that has implications far outside of just me and my own life.
Yeah, I think it was, that's great. I love that distinction. I think it was, who was it? Was it Richard Hayes or somebody said that the Sermon on the Mount is kind of like the New Testament charter for how this new covenant community is supposed to live and act. Like, it's not the whole corporate or national versus individual. Like, that's not really the focus here. Jesus is trying to give a new way of being human, a new way
for a community. This is how you as a community live. Yeah. Okay, two more. We're running out of time. 2 more quick questions.
Yeah, how far can you get into a conversation about nonviolence before Bonhoeffer comes up and where he becomes especially problematic, as both the pacifists use him on our side?
Yeah, I used him on Sunday, and people were like, "Wait, didn't he?"
Yeah, and then the
kill Hitler or something.
The critics of nonviolence use him on their side. So I'm sure this is something that you've thought about. What do you think about Bonhoeffer as a famous, noted pacifist in his writings and thinkings, but also being implicated with an alleged assassination attempt on Hitler? I know that there's been some new material published in the last 3 or 4 years that is now beginning to argue that maybe he wasn't involved or as involved. And in either event, what do we think about Bonhoeffer and his writings? And is it okay for me and John Mark to quote him in our teaching?
Absolutely. I love the Bonhoeffer discussion because I think people kind of throw it out as like an intended pushback. And I think when you really look at it, is like, I don't think there's anything really that's pushing back here on me. I mean, I'm glad you acknowledge that there is a debate among Bonhoeffer scholars whether or not he was really, kind of a main architect or even involved in trying to kill Hitler. And I haven't waded through all the original evidence, but apparently it's not crystal clear.
It's in question.
It is in question. But let's just assume that he was part of that plot. If he was tormented by that. He was agonizing over it. And we're talking about Hitler here. Like the person who most Christians they would get mad at you for even raising a question whether or not we should kill Hitler. Like that's just like a no-brainer. For Bonhoeffer, it wasn't a no-brainer. It was something he deeply wrestled with. Again, assuming this is all kind of, the best reading of the material, but he was wrestling with it. He was agonizing with it. It was something that he probably would have repented for later if he actually succeeded. Right. Well, if that was the spirit of evangelical Christians, I would say, man, well done. Hats off. If we're only willing to use violence against the Hitlers of the world, then
as a last case scenario, and as we do it, we're begging for the mercy of God.
Agonizing,
he almost seems to me like the best example of what you do when you're in an impossible situation.
Totally.
Whether that's the extreme scenario of the attacker in the middle of the night with your family or a Hitler. He just seems like a bright, shining example of, even if at some point you resort to violence, you do it begging for the mercy of God.
And this is also a perfect example that the scenario of either let evil run rampant or you stop evil by violence, that simplistic, really fictitious scenario, doesn't exist because in that scenario, they tried to kill Hitler. It failed. And what happened? Hitler saw that as God's favor upon him. And so he cranked up the, Auschwitz even hotter, ended up slaughtering way more people in the wake of that success on his part of escaping the attempt because he believed God was behind him. So
right or wrong, that assassination attempt made the situation worse.
Yes. That's absolutely.
And right or wrong, the actions of one historical pacifist, whether they are in cooperation or violation of their personal views, aren't necessarily a silver bullet to the nonviolent position of Jesus.
Yeah, either way. It's just a great question. All right, last question, Preston, and we'll let you go. This is a great one, a more pastoral question. And I got this from a number of people. So here it is, quote, how am I supposed to support my dad who retired from the military? Am I supposed to be thankful towards people who served in the military? Well, I just love that question, love the heart behind it. How would you, from a pastoral how would you answer that?
That's a great question. And my dad served in the military. My uncle served in the military. My grandpa, I come from a long line of military family members. I got many friends who have served, the neighbors. And my eager response is you honor that person. There's many noteworthy virtues that go into military service. They are sacrificing their lives in many different ways. They are exemplifying courage. The problem is not so much with the individuals that are going into the military. The problem is Christian leaders have created a narrative in our Christian subculture that is not only allowing but pushing people to do that. Like, we have so bought into the cultural celebration of military service that of course people would be like, well, why? How? I don't blame my dad for going into it. I don't blame the grandpa or whatever who served in the military and put his life on the line. Like, those are courageous virtues. It's the misguided Christian subculture which stems from the leadership that I think is really where the blame is. So when it comes to individuals, I have no problem saying, obviously not saying I agree with everything they did, but I'm going to say that, like, man, I have no problem honoring the many virtues that went into that service.
Well, we're out of time. We're going to wrap it up for the day. Preston, thank you for your time. Thank you for your hard work on this subject. Thank you for your courage, your thoughtfulness, your boldness. Thanks for working out and being such a pro.
Thanks so much for having me on, guys.
It's great. Awesome. You're listening to the Bridgetown Church podcast. For more content, visit bridgetown.church. See you soon.